In our second Sebastian Rogers video, I learned that in the South, put the dogs up means put them away, not physically put them up somewhere, and I thank you all for telling me, and by all I do mean literally all of you. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lunch. At the beginning of July 2024, I was asked to look into the case of Sebastian Rogers, a missing 15-year-old autistic boy from Hendersonville, Tennessee. In case you haven't seen the previous two videos in this series, the short version is that Sebastian disappeared back on February 26th of this year. According to the story told by his mother and his stepfather, she woke up to get him ready for school on a Monday, and he wasn't in bed, he wasn't in the kitchen, he was nowhere in the house, and there were no footprints, no scent leading away. The police have been totally unable to figure out where Sebastian went after he left the house that evening. His stepfather and his mom say that they believe that he simply left the house of his own volition. He didn't take his phone, he didn't take his switch, he didn't even take his shoes, and they don't know why, and they don't know where he might be, and they're very distraught about the fact that he has not yet been found. As we discussed in part 2 of this series, however, those parents can't be trusted to tell the truth about basically anything. Chris Proudfoot has lied about everything from whether or not he took a polygraph test to how many times he beat his son, oddly admitting that he did in fact beat his son. We also know that Chris and Katie, whose last name is Proudfoot, left their home in the middle of the search before even a month had passed from Sebastian's disappearance. And when they left their home, they said that Chris had to go back to work at a job that in that very same interview in which he said he was going back to work, well, he told Nancy Grace, the interviewer, that he didn't know if he still had that job. I'm not going to go through the entire thing that we went through in part 2, obviously, and if you haven't seen it, I recommend that you watch it before watching this, but what I want to say here is that after finishing the research for it, after shooting the video, I was extremely suspicious of Chris Proudfoot. And I think the way that I would describe this is that most of my suspicions centered around one particular aspect of the story. Towards the end of our second video on the Sebastian Rogers disappearance, the one that came out a week before this one, I said that there was a bunch of stuff that I felt I couldn't yet talk about, that I had come across, that I had noted, and that I had begun investigating, but wasn't quite at the point where I could present it and feel like I had given you the full story. And when I said that, what I had in mind were accusations from some people against other people involved in the story. I was thinking about, different accounts of court battles that I needed to make sure I could nail down who was telling the truth about which situation. Basically, while we had established in part 2 that Chris Proudfoot absolutely has been lying since the start of this investigation about a number of different things, there were other factors that I needed to consider before fully putting the spotlight on the Proudfoot family. Essentially, I had a whole bunch of threads, but I had yet to follow them back to the source. Well, one of those threads that I did not weave into part 2 was a quote that Chris gave when he was asked about an accusation that he had verbally abused Sebastian's paternal grandmother. Now, silly me, I did not actually put the exact citation in line in this script, but I believe this was from either the March 3rd or March 17th interview with Duchess. And what Chris said was this: to clear up her statement about me being verbally abusive to her, unfortunately, she's not going to tell you the full story. But there's always, remember, 3 sides to the truth: hers, mine, and the truth in itself. So you can figure it out, me and the grandmother had a conversation. And this all stems back to an incident that a family member did that, as the parents, we had consulted with law enforcement about something. They recommended not doing it. Lo and behold, something happened and something was done against what we decided. I reached out to the mom, Katie, and I asked her for help during that conversation. Some accusations got flung in my direction and toward my wife, which the mother or the grandmother actually doesn't have the whole story. She has never once sat down with me, my wife, her son, Seth, and gotten the full truth on everything. She's only heard one side of the story, and I can promise you, I've got text messages, and I'm not afraid to show them. I'm not afraid to screenshot them and let the public see it. Now, I will say, unfortunately, none of this has to do with the investigation of our son, but yes, we had a heated discussion. Now, that entire statement is very vague. It's a weird statement. It's a non-answer, because the question he was asked was basically, did you or did you not verbally abuse Seth Rogers' mother? Chris turns it around, he makes himself the victim, he says that there's a whole bunch of things that, oh, she's never asked, she doesn't understand, she won't let me explain. But if you'll notice, Chris doesn't explain anything. And this is something that I looked at, something that I pointed out in part 2 in the video about how Chris just lies constantly. Chris has a habit of, when asked certain questions, not answering them. Giving an answer, but avoiding any actual information being given. And while Chris said in this statement that he could prove what he was saying, that he had the screenshots, he had the text messages, as far as I'm aware, he has never released them, even months later. So to be honest with you, I think that the reason that Chris avoids giving out actual information and the reason that he so often lied is because if he were to tell the truth about most of these questions, it would reveal the biggest lie of them all, which is what he said at the end of the quote. This has nothing to do with the investigation of his son. And throughout what remains of this video, it is my intention to give the police the tools they need to verify whether or not I am correct. Now, I do want to be clear before we get into the meat of this video. It is not my intention to claim that I have proven anything. I am not intending to make a statement of fact that Chris Proudfoot knows what happened to his son. It is my sole intention with this video to present the evidence I have collected and my analysis, my opinion of what that evidence suggests. While I will give statements of fact in this video, they will be supported by something concrete. So if I say something's factual, it's because I was able to dig up the facts behind it. I was able to provide a court record, a transcript, an interview statement, something like that. But the overall message of the video, that is my opinion based upon those facts. If I say something untrue in this video, this is me telling you right now that it is not because I deliberately gave you false information. It is because I had bad information. That said, I am fairly confident in what I've accumulated here, and by the time you will be seeing this video, all of this will have been forwarded to the appropriate authorities. Now, with all of that out of the way, I usually would give you some kind of clever transition for this, but due to the subject matter of the video, I would like to simply just introduce our partner for today, Factor. Thornbury and I have been working with Factor for over a year now, and it's because we actually like them. It's good food. There are lots of options. They've got 34 to 35 or more menu options at any given time. They have keto plans. They have high protein plans. It's a good service for somebody who is busy, who doesn't have a ton of time to cook for themselves, and for people who enjoy good food. Everything is chef-crafted, dietitian-improved, and delivered straight to your door, and one of my favorite aspects of it is that I'm always a person who struggles with snacking. If I keep snack food in the house, I will eat it, and I will not eat it as a snack. I will eat it as a meal. So it's hard for me to keep little munchy things around. But with Factor, I can keep stuff in the cabinet that I can munch on and not feel like I'm going against my health plan. They've got snacks, they even have cookies, they have smoothies, they have shakes, they have breakfast. And the best part of that is that you're not getting stuck with like little bland stuff. You can get anything from a nice simple chicken dish with some Italian inspiration up through a filet mignon. And I'm a guy who likes steak. I've been raised on good steak. I like their steak. If you'd like to give Factor a try and see what it is that Aiden and I have been talking about for the last, again, over a year, you can head to factor75.com and use code LORELODGE50 to get 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off the next 4. Again, that is code LORELODGE50 at factor75.com to get 50% off your first box and 20% off the next 4 orders. One of the more intriguing theories about Sebastian's disappearance centers on something that, at first, doesn't necessarily seem like it would be connected. And that is Chris Proudfoot's attempts to obtain primary custody of his daughter, Faith. Now, Chris has repeatedly denied that there is any connection between these two situations, but as we have established, you should not trust Chris to even tell you where he slept last night. To quickly revisit what I mean by that, Chris has verifiably lied about taking a polygraph test, being cleared by law enforcement, dogs picking up Sebastian's scent at the house, how many times he beat Sebastian with a belt, and how many times he'd been visited by CPS because he'd beaten Sebastian with a belt. So from there, it's not really a stretch to at least ask the question of if Chris could be lying about whether or not there is a connection between Sebastian moving out and Faith moving in. And along with the fact that we know Chris has lied multiple times about this case, we also have the testimony from his ex-wife and the mother of his daughter Faith about what her relationship was like and how he treated her children, his stepchildren from that marriage. And then wrapped into all of this are the details of Seth and Katie's divorce in 2016 and how Chris got involved in Sebastian's life and the chronology there and some accusations that were leveled against Seth that I would have to question now that Sebastian was supposedly moving in with him. In order to properly explain how all of this connects, however, I feel like I first need to give you the breakdown of how Chris and Nina's versions of this story play out. And from there, I think it's important to go over the problems, the possible inaccuracies in both accounts. Now, in part 2, we did briefly discuss the relationship between Chris and his ex-wife Nina. And we dipped our toes into the ways in which her version of events paints a much darker picture of Chris Proudfoot, Katie Proudfoot, and really the entire Proudfoot clan than what Chris would have us believe. You see, by the time that Duchess held her panel on March 17th and invited Chris and Katie on, there was a rumor spreading, and I haven't tracked down the origin of the rumor, but there was a rumor spreading that Chris had a history of domestic violence. And during that interview, Duchess asked if Sebastian was scared of Chris, and Chris explained his perspective and told the panel that, as parents, you have rules they have to follow. If they don't, there's consequences. Of course, we now know that those consequences included a belt to the rear end by Chris's own admission, but this is not the domestic violence that they were talking about, and Chris knew this. And he went on and explained that he did not have a domestic violence charge or conviction, but there had been a temporary protective order placed against him in New Mexico. As Chris tells the story, his domestic troubles with Nina began when Faith was about 6 weeks old. This would have been mid-July of 2017, shortly after he had facilitated Nina moving from Albuquerque, New Mexico, where her family was, to Hendersonville, Tennessee, where his family was. It was at this time that he says an event took place while I was holding my daughter. And he goes on to explain, I was holding my daughter in my left arm. Okay, mind you, she was a little baby. She was up against my chest, cuddled up next to my cheek and my shoulder. And he says that Nina approached him and accused him of having an affair based on a text message she'd seen. Chris said that the text came from a coworker who he not only was not engaged in any kind of relationship with, but who was also not into men. Naturally, he denied the affair, which he said resulted in Nina slapping him across his left cheek. And it was at this point that he says, I had to do what I had to do based on being a parent, which is what's best for my child. In this case, what he thought was best for his child was to file a temporary protective order against Nina, which kept her from seeing Faith until their court date. The court, however, ultimately sided with Nina, and Chris gave Faith back to her, at which point he says she jumped in the truck and flew right back to New Mexico, and within 2 days of being there, she turned around and filed the exact same thing against him. As for any connection to his missing stepson, he said that it had absolutely zero bearing on this case with Sebastian, and that he wanted to ask people to refrain from bringing that up because it has no bearing. If we were to take Chris at his word here, then it really would sound like he just had a jealous wife and it escalated into physical violence. But after seeing how easily lies seem to roll off his tongue, I simply was not going to take him at face value. Thankfully, a man by the name of Trevor Lee was able to get Nina to sit for an interview, and she had a lot more to say about her past and present relationship with Chris. I should say, before going into this, that I'm not intending to present Nina's version of events as any kind of absolute truth. I'm simply going to tell you what it is that she said about her relationship with Chris. And then when we get to the end, I'll go through and tell you what I was able to verify, what I was not able to verify, what turned out to be actually contradicted by the evidence, and I'll then explain how this connects to Sebastian. Not only is there considerably more to the story about the specific incident Chris referenced when Nina tells it, but the details of how Chris is alleged to have behaved towards her and her children in my opinion, closely echo his situation with Sebastian, and to the extent that they feel too similar to not be connected. Nina's version of the story started with meeting Chris on a dating app or dating website when she was a 35-year-old single mother of 2, and he was a thrice-divorced sailor living on a naval base in San Diego. She married him after only a couple of visits, moved to San Diego, and then from there, it's a sad story of a woman falling for a man who she claims has since turned her life into a living nightmare, even after their divorce. She says that he would spank her 3-year-old son Noah and force both him and her 7-year-old daughter Isabella to stand in a corner for timeout entirely too often. I don't know precisely what that means, but I'm assuming it means more than, you would expect. The way it's phrased, it sounds like she's saying that these were not necessary punishments. When Nina became pregnant with Faith, Chris encouraged her to get an abortion, even though she explicitly told him she didn't want to. Then, months later, after she had moved back in with her parents to have some support during the pregnancy, she got a call from a neighbor who told her that Chris was getting rid of her things, like just giving away her furniture, her mementos, her keepsakes, her decorations, all of that. When she confronted him about all of this, he told her that he was worried about her or their unborn child dying on the table, even though there had been really no reason to suspect that might happen. In addition to that, he did not explain why he was getting rid of her things. He seems to have done that thing where you'll ask a question and he'll answer something else to the extent that you didn't realize he didn't answer your first question. Nina also said that because Chris was not supporting her with the pregnancy and he was being abusive towards her children, she moved back to Albuquerque so that she could live with her parents for the duration of the pregnancy. And Chris did not show up again until after Faith was born. Instead of driving out immediately when he had gotten the call that Nina was going into labor, Chris waited a few days, called the hospital a few times and verbally abused the nurses, and then when he finally did show up after Faith was born on June 2nd, he continued to verbally abuse the nurses. Nina says that he was actually nearly kicked out several times for verbally abusing the staff. Now, Nina did say that Faith had to go back into the hospital to the NICU because she was jaundiced and she had to stay there for a week or a week and a half, during which period Chris did stay, and Chris's mother, Kathy, flew out to visit them. Then after this period, once she was out of the hospital, they stayed in Air Force housing at Kirtland Air Force Base very briefly before Chris returned to San Diego. Nina seems to imply that after giving birth, she wanted to move back in with her parents, but Chris didn't want to do that, and that's why they ended up on the Air Force Base. I should also mention that Nina claims that while living in Air Force Base housing, Chris was abusive towards Faith even, and that he threw her car seat while she was in it onto a coffee table. Why did he do this? It was because Faith was crying. Why was Faith crying? It was because he had allowed her car seat to bump into a wall. As I said, he did not stay in New Mexico for long, but only a few days after he returned to San Diego, Nina says that she called him and suggested that she move to Hendersonville. Nina says that at the time, she did not understand where this suggestion had come from, as she already had a support system in Albuquerque. But after some time, she says she formulated an idea. She thinks she knows what happened here. As I said, while Faith was in the NICU, Kathy flew down, and she also brought, I believe, Chris's uncle, a man by the name of Duran. And it's Nina's belief that it was at this time that the three of them made a plan. But at the time, Nina was still taking care of her newborn daughter, who was, again, in the neonatal ICU, so she wasn't paying a ton of attention to any machinations going on in the background. So, despite a sense of unease with the entire arrangement, Nina moved out to Tennessee and spent the first month living with Kathy and Chris's stepfather, Terry Bowersox, or it might be Bowersox, for about a month until the apartment that Chris had rented for them was ready. Now, working out a timeline for all of these events was a little bit difficult, but Nina says that Faith was born June 2nd, that Chris stayed for about a week or so afterwards, and that Kathy came to pick Faith up to take Faith specifically to Tennessee a few weeks after that. And then Nina made her way out to Tennessee. So it seems like mid to late July that they made the move. During that time, Nina says that living with Chris's stepfather was uncomfortable, and that Terry and Kathy would always bicker at each other, and she'd be bickering with Christopher, and my kids were a problem, an issue, it was always something. And that kids always being an issue thing did catch my eye because of something else that she said, which is that she needed to get a job while she was there, because I guess Chris's military salary, after nearly 20 years in the Navy, somehow was not paying for their expenses. Nina says at a few different points in her story that Chris was not paying for anything, that she was using her own savings, that she was using the money she got from her job. For the moment, that's neither here nor there, and we'll come back to it. The point is that while she was at work, Michael Proudfoot and Linda Proudfoot, Chris's father and stepmother, they offered to watch the kids. But Kathy did not want Faith going to stay with Michael and Linda during the day. So Kathy offered to watch Faith. In fact, according to Nina, Kathy insisted upon watching Faith. So if Nina is to be believed, then the Proudfoot family, whether you're just going to put it on Kathy, or if you're going to claim that Michael and Linda were in on it, the Proudfoot family deliberately separated Faith from her brother and sister at one of the most crucial bonding points in that baby's life. In addition to this poor living situation, Chris's behavior only deteriorated after the move, with Nina claiming that at one point he backhanded her daughter Isabella so hard, reminder, Isabella's about 7 or 8 at the time, so hard that her lip bled. And in case you're wondering why it is that she moved to Tennessee in the first place, I did go over it in part 2, but she still was trying to make the marriage work. She was hoping that the version of Chris that she knew before they got married would come back. In any case, when they were finally able to move into their apartment, which Nina says was at the end of August 2017, Chris moved them in, and then he made all the arrangements necessary, and then he was preparing to go back to San Diego. The night before he was supposed to fly out, however, Nina says that he got a text message, which said something along the lines of, "Hey baby, when is your flight coming in?" Keep in mind, end of August 2017. Nina questioned him about this, only to be told that this person was a lesbian and she had nothing to worry about. But she did not believe him, and she was furious because, in her opinion, she'd just seen proof that he was cheating on her, so she slapped him. In the midst of all of this, Isabella, Nina's other daughter, developed a severe upper respiratory condition and had to go to the hospital at Vanderbilt in Nashville. Because she wasn't sure how long she'd have to stay there, she had her son, Noah, who would have been 3 or 4 at this time, stay with Melissa, Chris's sister. One of Chris's sisters, at least. I don't know if he has multiple. It seems like he does. And then Faith stayed with Kathy. And if there was a trap, this is when it was sprung. What I mean by that is that, according to Nina, when she and Isabella returned home from Vanderbilt, Melissa met her at their apartment with Noah. Kathy, however, did not show up. Instead, an attorney by the name of Patty Garner, who Nina says was a friend of Kathy Proudfoot, showed up with a temporary protective order and informed her that Chris planned to file for divorce. Nina tried to call Chris, but he wouldn't pick up the phone, so she went to the sheriff's office to ask them for help, and they told her that it was a legal order, so there was nothing they could do. And with no other options, she drove over to the Bowersox residence so that she could hopefully talk to Kathy and Terry about what was going on. As she did this, hoping to have some backup, she kept Linda Proudfoot, Chris's stepmother, on the phone. But when she approached the door, she says that Terry answered and told her to get off his f***ing property, and then threatened her with a black and green baseball bat. And Linda, it appears, was not of much help, and Nina says that she believes that that side of the family was in on it. So, with all of the Proudfoots seemingly aligned against her, Nina reached out to her own family back in the Southwest, who told her to stay put, they were coming out immediately. And while they were making their way out from Albuquerque, she started to look for legal counsel in Hendersonville. Nina did not have much money for a lawyer, which she says she believes was the reason that Chris forced her to use her own money to pay for everything, but she was able to get the assistance of an attorney by the name of Mr. Michael Edwards. I will get into it a little bit more later, but I was able to contact Mr. Edwards. He confirmed that he did represent Nina, and the court records from Tennessee also confirmed that he represented Nina. With the assistance of Mr. Edwards, she was able to win the case and have the temporary protective order overturned, with Chris being ordered to return Faith to her the next morning at 8:30 a.m. Based on court records, I believe that would make the exchange date October 3rd, 2017. On that morning, she and her father went to go pick up Faith, and she had her father waited at a Wendy's up the road, he said. She said, sorry. And the reason for this was so that he could follow her out. However, when she went to perform the exchange, she says that the entire Proudfoot family was there and they were not exactly cooperative. She says they live streamed the entire thing on Facebook, saying things like, "I can't believe the judge awarded her custody," while she was just asking to have her daughter back. Allegedly, as part of this, Kathy threw a brown paper sack full of diapers and a dirty bottle at her as well, saying, "I think you're going to need this," while she laughed. She goes on to explain that after Chris had finally handed over Faith, Nina started strapping her in, but as soon as she went to do so, Chris got into the driver's seat of her truck. Again, she says all of this was live streamed to Facebook by the Proudfoots. And if it was, one of those live streams should have caught Chris's sister Melissa saying, "Why don't you put it in reverse and drive over her?" Nina says she scrambled to get her kids out of the car, and just as she got Faith out, Chris did in fact put the car into reverse and begin driving backwards. She and her children then attempted to escape into the sheriff's office, but she says that nobody would let them in until Chris came up behind her, and then they walked all of them inside. And while there, she says that she and her kids were kept in a back room with the lights turned off, and that as she was trying to call her attorney, Kathy took the phone and disconnected the call. As for how she got out of this situation, apparently she was able to speak to Edwards long enough that he was able to explain to the sheriff's department that if this were to get out, it would be really bad for Chris's military career, so they should probably let her go. But again, if Nina's story is to be believed, the ordeal was not over, because allegedly, Chris's family got in their cars as she was leaving the sheriff's office and chased her and her father down the interstate at 80 to 90 miles an hour. And it seems she at least believed she was being chased long enough that they didn't even feel safe stopping when they got to Little Rock, Arkansas, and they drove all the way through to Albuquerque, New Mexico in one day. And upon her arrival there, Nina immediately went to the courts, and the New Mexico records confirm this, like October 4th. The New Mexico records say that she filed a TPO, and she filed for divorce. Their divorce was eventually finalized in 2018 after quite a lengthy process of trying to work out the custody arrangements. But even after the divorce, Nina says that there was sort of a constant pestering about custody and making sure that Chris had a say in absolutely everything that Faith did. And it even seems that on a couple of occasions he motioned to get custody of Faith, but it just didn't go anywhere. And then, on December 27th, 2023, things escalated. On that day, Nina had to take Faith to the airport because their custody arrangement granted Chris half the Christmas season. And when she got there, she would be meeting Katie, who would be taking Faith back to Tennessee. And Nina also says that when she arrived at the airport, Katie was filming their entire interaction, and apparently this is something she always does. You know, Aiden, I'd be willing to bet that if she's been filming, all of the times she's filmed are probably also on the cloud.
I would imagine so.
I would imagine law enforcement could probably verify if this was filmed. Most likely, correct?
I would say so.
I would say so. And you know what? I also would say that if they were live streaming to Facebook in 2017, Facebook should at the very least have a record that a live stream occurred, even if the video has been deleted, right?
Generally.
Yeah, which the FBI could easily subpoena.
I mean, they might even be able to use the Wayback Machine.
That's true. Ooh, no, couldn't use Wayback. I went and checked Chris Proudfoot. I couldn't find, there's no record on Wayback of any of the Proudfoots so far as I can tell. Well, no, I mean, Alexa doesn't automatically crawl every web page. Usually there has to be a reason for it. Like if a search term goes viral or, you know, a page gets a lot of visits, well then it'll get crawled by the bots that feed the Wayback Machine. But in this case, you're not gonna be able to see anything unless there was a reason to archive it. And when it comes to private Facebook pages or personal Facebook pages, there's generally not a ton of reason to do so. But, you know, to take us back into where we were, which is the fact that, or I guess the allegation that when Nina took Faith to the airport on December 27, 2023, Katie filmed the entire interaction, and then after Nina had handed Faith over to Katie, a man approached her as she was getting into her car and had some papers in his hand, and he said, "Are you Nina Gomez?" And when she said, "Yes, I am," he attempted to hand her the papers and say, "You've been served." As it turns out, both according to Nina and verified by court documents, that man was named Michael Tinker, and he was a lawyer hired by the Proudfoot family to engage in a custody case that was ongoing. Because, once again, Chris was still fighting for custody this whole time. And I know I said we're going to go through what's verifiable. I just want to be clear right here. This is all verifiable. This is all in the New Mexico court records. Chris tried to get custody. He reopened this case in September of 2023. So all of this interaction, this all happened during a custody battle. I'll get a little bit deeper into the specifics of that custody battle later on in the video. The point of the matter is that when Nina was handed papers by an attorney after just handing Faith over to a member of the Proudfoot family, she panicked. Because this is precisely what happened 6 years earlier when Chris used a TPO to take Faith from her the first time. So Nina bolted from the car without taking the papers. She ran through the airport screaming that Katie was going to kidnap her daughter, grabbed Faith, and then went and called the Albuquerque Police Department, who, she says during the Christmas season, have officers stationed at the airport at all times. And Nina says that Katie got all of this on film too. The police arrived shortly after Nina called them, but just like in 2017, they told her, there's nothing we can do. This is a legal part of the custody arrangement, and them serving you papers doesn't change that. Basically, it was Chris's weekend, so he'd done nothing wrong. And this obviously frustrated Nina quite a bit, but it was only once she looked at the papers she had been served that she says everything became clear to her. That's because the papers she was handed were not a TPO. They were not a temporary protective order at all. They were a summons to a hearing she not only already knew about, but had been informed of multiple times and planned to attend. In any case, those papers that she was served were in reference to that same hearing, which was on January 2nd, 2024. And she says that the day of that hearing, Chris and Katie used the incident at the airport to not only motion to relocate Faith to Tennessee, but also to order a psych evaluation for Nina. The evidentiary hearing for that was scheduled for March 5th, 2024, but just a week before that was supposed to happen, Sebastian Rogers disappeared. And at first, Nina thought that this was all a ploy, that Chris was just making this up as a way to get out of that hearing and maybe buy time to construct a more solid case or just kind of, drag things out. But as the days went on, it became clear to her that this was real. Sebastian actually was missing. There is some more said. Nina goes over, how this has affected her life. She gives a few more details. I would recommend that everybody go and watch through it or listen through it because there's a lot of detail. It's 2 hours long. I obviously could not distill the entire thing down for this video. But what I've given you here are the key aspects, the things that matter the most to the argument we're making here. The interview as a whole presents Chris as this abusive, controlling, manipulative narcissist, and his family does not come across much better. But the question here is this an accurate account of events? Contested custody battles can be some of the most bitter legal fights there are, and exaggerations and manipulations of the truth from exes in order to get the upper hand on one another are not unheard of. So it's important that we take a step back and consider the evidence. We're not taking Chris at face value, so it's only fair that we also don't take Nina at face value. While I find much of Nina's narrative compelling, there are a few things that kind of immediately stick out as improbable, if not impossible. Some even could be corroborated or debunked if law enforcement knew where to look. Most of the events that Nina described would, or at least should, have been observed by objective witnesses. So I think the best place to start is with the more unlikely ones, the ones that weren't witnessed. This would, of course, include all of Nina's allegations of domestic abuse against Chris, as those incidents happened when nobody else was in the home but them. While I don't doubt that Chris would have been abusive towards Nina's kids based on the fact that he admitted being abusive towards Katie's son, there's no doctor's visits or police reports to corroborate this. A better example may be her story about what happened after the custody exchange, where she says that the Proudfoots got in their cars and followed her and her father down the interstate at 80 to 90 miles an hour. On its face, this seems rather strange simply due to how absurd it is, but absurdity is not evidence against something. Absurd things do happen. But there are further issues with this portion of the narrative that should probably be considered. One question I have is if she actually meant interstate rather than just highway, because the only interstate route in the area that would lead to Albuquerque is I-40. And the nearest entrance to I-40 from Gallatin, Tennessee is near West Nashville. What that means is that if they were chasing her on the interstate, they had to follow her 30 to 35 miles through or around Nashville just to get to I-40. Now, it's not impossible, it's just a little hard to believe, and of course on top of that, there is the option that she may have just thought she was being followed because she was panicking. And the reason I include this segment in this section about stuff that can't be corroborated is the chances that there's going to be evidence of this car chase are just extremely slim. I mean, this many years on, nobody's going to remember if they may have seen a car chase on I-40 on October 3rd, 2017. It's just not going to happen. It might be worth law enforcement looking in to see if they can find evidence of her car making these motions on that day, but I doubt it. The other one that really jumped out was what happened after the TPO was served, with her going over to the Bowersox residence to speak with Kathy and then being threatened with a bat by Terry. In addition, she also said in her story that they claimed Chris had already returned to San Diego at this point, but that she saw Chris's shadow in the room. Again, hard to corroborate. And the reason that I say this isn't possible to corroborate is, well, you might be able to use like cell phone records or something else. I mean, obviously he was in the Navy, so maybe his movement was tracked in some way. Somebody would have to admit that Terry threatened her with a bat in order to corroborate this story fully, and nobody's going to admit that Terry threatened her with a bat. The good news is that outside of those, basically everything else she said happened would or should have been recorded or observed by outside witnesses. But not all of those claims have been corroborated yet, such as Chris removing the furniture from the home. An example of this would be what happened immediately prior to the highway chase, which is that whole affair with the custody transfer at the sheriff's office in Gallatin. I will say I reached out to the sheriff's office in Sumner County, which is the one that would be in Gallatin, and they told me that they had no record of this happening and no recollection of this happening, and that everything up until an ex parte motion filed in New Mexico was handled by the Hendersonville Police Department. That said, everything I'm about to say still remains true regardless of what they said there. That's because Nina claims that everything from her driving up to the sheriff's office to her being led into the sheriff's office was live streamed. If this is true, then as Aiden and I kind of joked about earlier in, a bit of foreshadowing, the TBI or the FBI should be able to subpoena Facebook's live streaming records from all of the Proudfoot's accounts. At the very least, they should be able to confirm whether or not any of those accounts live streamed on that date and at that time. And in addition to that, unless those live streams were deleted afterwards, then they may be able to actually verify what happened. If there aren't any records of live streams, then obviously that's not great for Nina's account of events, but it's possible she just misunderstood what they were doing when they were holding their phones up. Thing is, if this did happen at the Gallatin Sheriff's Office, then the Sheriff's Office, you would assume, would have security cameras looking out at the parking lot that should have witnessed this happening. And they should have had security cameras that witnessed her being led inside and kept in a back room. Of course, that requires those videos also not being deleted. But if there's a chunk of security footage missing from between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. on that morning from the sheriff's office, I would argue that's suspicious as well. But that said, I contacted the sheriff's office and they said that this didn't happen there, but instead happened at the Hendersonville Police Department. And if it happened at the Hendersonville Police Department, well then the same rings true. There should be security footage of this. Now, directly connected to this part of the claim is the part of the claim where she was shuffled into the back room with the lights off, all of that. I did call her lawyer, as I said. It took me a while to get him to open up to me at all. He did not want to talk to me. He's probably got a whole bunch of calls from journalists over the last few months and did not want to talk to another one. But after basically proving to him that I knew the details of the case as well as I possibly could, he opened up a little bit and he told me that he had no recollection of that phone call, of telling the police that this would be bad for Chris's career. Actually, we never got that far in the conversation. He had no recollection of this at all. He did not recall the phone call. That said, he did not impugn Nina's reputation. He did not say that she was lying. He just said he had no recollection, and he felt the need, unprompted, to tell me she's a good woman. Like, I did not ask, what's your opinion of Nina? He just said, she's a good woman. But like I said, all of this, based on how many cameras should have been involved, should be corroborable without any statement from anybody. Going back to that overall category of verifiable yet uncorroborated claims, I think that Nina's story about the airport also kind of falls into this category. And that's primarily because there's been no evidence presented to the public to back up her claims. That said, I really have no reason to doubt this part of the narrative based on what I've learned overall about the Proudfoots, and obviously there's more coming in this video, so that stuff too. I have no reason to doubt that she's not telling the truth, and that does appear in the court records, that a psych evaluation was requested, and that it was requested after this all occurred. So I think that one would be pretty easy for law enforcement to verify if any of that happened. Airports are some of the most closely monitored places on the planet, so if this happened, the law enforcement can absolutely determine what went on here. That said, just because the overall story of what happened at the airport may be true, I am a little curious about some of what Nina said, because there are a few contradictions, such as who went to the airport with her. She only names her boyfriend Wayne, her son Noah, and her daughter Isabella as accompanying her and Faith to the airport, but then she also said something that implied her mother was there too. Specifically, that was, and oh my god, my mom, like the first thing she thought was like, and Wayne thought it was like, oh my god, Nina's going to just lay her out. Again, could be misspeaking, could be her misremembering the events, but either way, it would suggest that she's not a perfectly reliable narrator, and that should be factored in when considering her allegations. And that's in addition to the conflict of interest. But before I go any further in this, I just want to be clear about the reason I formatted this way, the way I organized things, because I have no intention of saying that Nina is lying. I have no evidence to suggest that Nina lied. I just wanted to point out that there are some places where her story may have holes. Whether those holes are a result of lies or just misremembering, as I said, I have no evidence to say. You know, she's only made, so far as I can tell, the one appearance, whereas Chris has made numerous, and the only reason I was able to really pick up on Chris's lies was because they showed up as he did more interviews. Fortunately, there are some things about her story that can be verified without needing to wade through any hearsay. Chris presented his relationship with Nina as very much like Katie's with her ex-husband, and said, "We have a great relationship with each other," while Nina clearly described the opposite, and the evidence is on her side. The court records from New Mexico show a clear and consistent pattern of Chris Proudfoot motioning to modify custody with clear resistance by Nina, and there is no such history of custody battles between Katie and Seth. I know using that quote as an example may seem like a reach, and if it were not part of a larger pattern of dishonesty, I probably wouldn't even mention it. But it is part of a larger pattern of dishonesty, and the lie is relevant. In addition, there is a contradiction between Chris and Nina's version of events, which on its face may seem insignificant. But it tells us that, for whatever reason, Chris is not telling the truth about the timing. When Chris told the story, he said that Faith was 6 weeks old when Nina slapped him, and he filed for the TPO immediately. Since Faith was born June 2nd, 2017, even if we give Chris, 5 to 7 weeks as a bit of a buffer, this means that he could only have filed that TPO between July 7th and July 21st. Nina, however, said that this happened after Chris moved them into their apartment in Tennessee at the end of August, and that she was only served with papers after returning from Vanderbilt in September. In this case, there is no he said, she said. This is a legal proceeding, and it's present in the Tennessee court records. Nina was not served with a TPO in July when Faith would have been 6 weeks old, nor was she served in August, which could be perceived as immediately after this. Chris filed for that TPO on September 14th, 2017, when Faith was over 3 months old. Chris either waited a full 2 months to file the TPO, in which case he lied about filing it immediately, or he lied about how old Faith was when the incident occurred. This isn't to say that Nina can't be lying about anything, because she could be. The important part here is that we now know that Chris is willing to lie about his history with Faith, and that he definitely lied about the timing of this TPO. The question is why, and how does that connect to the disappearance of Sebastian Rogers? Having gone through the story of Chris Proudfoot and Nina Gomez's relationship and how Faith affected it, I want to turn your attention back to the original question at hand. Is it possible that Sebastian moving out of the Proudfoot home had something to do with Faith potentially moving in? Chris has been adamant that this is not the case, but there is a pretty big piece of evidence that he has not been able to overcome, and to my knowledge, that he has not denied. Chris Proudfoot told Seth Rogers that he did not want Sebastian around his daughter. Speaking on the Pascal show on April 5th, Seth said that people were asking Chris why he didn't want my son around his daughter, and he kept telling me that if people kept asking the question, he's going to answer it. As for what he meant by this, Seth elaborated that Chris said that if he tells them, people will stop looking for Sebastian. Pascal then clarified, "So you're telling me that he looks at Sebastian like some kind of predator," to which Seth simply replied, "Yeah." As for why, Seth tied it to something that happened to Sebastian under Chris and Katie's watch while they were still living in San Diego. Seth mentioned during a few different interviews that when Sebastian was 8, Chris and Katie left him alone with a 13-year-old boy, and as a result, Sebastian had his innocence taken from him. He used more explicit terms at other times, but I'm sure you can grasp what I'm suggesting here. Seth went on to explain that he felt that Sebastian had not received the proper kind of care or counseling, and that as a result, he hadn't properly processed or recovered from the traumatic experience. My son is a victim, he said, and if victims don't get the proper help, they repeat because all of a sudden they think it's normal. And studies show that victims of childhood sexual abuse will go on to become offenders themselves. So Seth is completely right about this. He continued, my son's autistic, and if he doesn't get the proper help, we don't want him to become that. And there's multiple different ways, but if you're not certified in the proper way to get him help, you're just going to make it worse. And the implication here, while never explicitly stated, is that whatever therapist or psychiatrist he was seeing did not have the correct credentials or training for this kind of trauma. Pascal was understandably confused as to what Sebastian had done to cause Chris to see him as, quote, some sort of monster, and Seth explained that Chris doesn't see him as innocent because Sebastian had done some questionable things. In Seth's opinion, these were more issues of Sebastian having autism and not understanding social cues or personal boundaries. So the things that Sebastian was doing, according to Seth, were more along the lines of, while in the men's room, revealing a certain part of his anatomy and asking other men what theirs looked like, which Seth said was innocent kid stuff, probably not the best terminology, but with autism, he's not really wrong. You know, I'm sure there are other people here watching that remember in grade school that, you know, sometimes the autistic kids, especially back in the 2000s when this stuff wasn't nearly as well understood or normalized, sometimes would pull their pants all the way down in the bathroom. I would be willing to bet just about every guy who went to public school has experienced that. It was never a predatory thing. It was not understanding that that's not what you do at that age or in public. In any case, so far as Seth was aware, Sebastian had never done anything like this to Faith, who he says Sebastian saw, or sees, if we're being optimistic here, as a younger sister. And this was confirmed in Nina Gomez's interview. Both Nina and Seth told separate interviewers that Sebastian and Faith had a normal sibling relationship, and they talked to each other on FaceTime, even though they weren't blood relatives. They just saw each other as siblings. And as I said, to my knowledge, Chris has not denied this conversation with Seth taking place, nor has he made a statement contradicting Seth's claims. Katie, on the other hand, has. Her response, however, was a Facebook comment that said that the boy who assaulted Sebastian was not 13, that they did not allow Sebastian to be abused, and that he did get help. What she didn't do was clarify the boy's age, which makes me think that he was probably closer in age to 13 than to 8. She also didn't name the therapist Sebastian was seeing, nor did she give any indication of what that therapist's credentials were. On the other hand, she did admit that Seth was involved in the therapy. And in my opinion, that actually makes Seth's argument stronger, because if he was involved in the therapy, then he is familiar with the treatment and has every right to believe it was inadequate. In addition to that, rather than clarifying anything that she said about the situation, she added that Seth was banned from the base for his violent tendencies, and then she said something weird. According to her, Sebastian was seeing therapists to help him with trauma from Seth's abuse and the trauma from being assaulted by this child. That part struck me, because there appears to be no record of Seth ever abusing Sebastian outside of his 2016 divorce proceedings with Katie Proudfoot. You may recall that earlier in this video, I implied that certain aspects of Nina's account of her relationship with Chris closely mirrored certain actions, certain things that happened during Seth and Katie's divorce. I've been unable to find the court records from those proceedings, but what I have been able to find is a set of documents from that period, in which Katie makes some allegations, and Seth responds. For some background, Katie and Seth were married on June 21st, 2008, and Sebastian was born on December 7th of that same year. The circumstances of how they met are a little murky, as are the details of their marriage, but what I do know is that on February 26, 2016, exactly 8 years to the day before Sebastian went missing, Katie filed for divorce. On August 29th of that year, Katie had forcibly removed Seth from the home via a temporary restraining order, on the basis of a number of allegations. Listing Sebastian as a protected party, Katie accused Seth of physically abusing Sebastian, writing that since returning from deployment in December, I have witnessed a multitude of events from Seth. Among these were claims that she had seen him hit Sebastian in the head, neck, and back, and grab him with both hands, lift his entire body up, slam him down, and then proceed to beat him. In addition, she said that Seth, on many cases, whipped him with a belt, not paying attention to where he was hitting because he was so angry. She also wrote, "Neighbors informed me that during my duty days, the days she had to be on base, they have seen Sebastian on multiple occasions coming outside the house crying and looking for his dad." And this was allegedly because Seth had been gone for long periods of time, and neighbors had to tell Sebastian to go inside and lock the door, but none of them called CPS. Along with the allegations of physical abuse, Katie also accused Seth of inappropriate sexual behavior. Specifically, she said that Seth would on a regular basis just walk into the living room and get naked, not caring that Sebastian sees this. There were also claims of emotional manipulation on Seth's part associated with their divorce and Sebastian's anxiety over his parents splitting up. Apparently, Seth would tell Sebastian, "This is all because mommy doesn't want to love daddy anymore." Katie was the one who filed for divorce, just to be clear. That is in the San Diego court records. I was able to find that. In addition to all of this were assertions that Sebastian's teachers were uncomfortable with Seth and requested that the principal be present during any meetings involving him. She said that while they were explaining Sebastian's condition to one of his teachers, which included fluid on his brain, a pocket of fluid on the right side of his brain, Seth became irritated with Sebastian and hit him on the head in front of a faculty member. She claims that after she criticized him for this, he told her it wasn't that hard and that people need to stop telling him how to raise his son. There were also claims about CPS and social workers being involved, with Katie saying that Sebastian was very afraid of his father. She said both she and the social worker had witnessed events like Sebastian waking up in the middle of the night kicking and screaming, and that once at school he wet himself and was terrified of what would happen if Seth found out. Sebastian was also supposedly afraid that Seth would beat him if he made a mistake, though Katie did not elaborate on what kind of mistakes these would be. She did say that she had arranged for Sebastian to see a therapist because of this trauma, and even said that Sebastian was suffering from PTSD related to this abuse. Finally, she accused Seth of manipulating her communications and preventing her from speaking to anyone, including her own family, without him listening in. It may be that that was put in there to explain why she hadn't told anyone about the abuse, why she hadn't sought any sort of outside help, because to this point there had been no police reports, no doctor's visits, nothing. Altogether, it paints a pretty dark portrait of Seth, but not one without some questionable claims, which is why there is a process before a temporary restraining order becomes a domestic violence restraining order. As part of that process, Seth submitted a response to Katie's allegations, in which he denied some things and argued that others didn't warrant a domestic violence restraining order, the hearing for which was set for September 16th, 2016. Seth wrote that Katie's request for a restraining order is based upon the following, then listed 5 arguments that Katie had submitted in her completed filing. It seems the document of hers that I have access to, which I found on Reddit, was more for the TRO than the DVRO, not the complete filing for the domestic violence restraining order. And I say that because the arguments he's responding to include stuff that wasn't necessarily laid out in the document I read. In any case, those reasons were that Seth was highly aggressive in his mannerisms, cursed and yelled at her, which he did not deny, but also did say that it wasn't a basis for a restraining order under the facts. She also said Seth was very angry, yelling at Sebastian, and Sebastian told her, "Daddy hit me." Seth denied hitting Sebastian entirely. She said that Seth yelled at her and Sebastian, then slammed a door, breaking it, which he did not deny and did say wasn't a basis for a restraining order under the facts. She said Seth had issues with his temper, which he denied and stated it wouldn't be a basis for a domestic violence restraining order even if true. And finally, she said Seth was using drugs, which he denied and stated that it wouldn't be a basis for a DVRO even if true. And then following that, he said, "As a result of these baseless allegations, I respectfully request the court deny Katie's request for a permanent domestic violence restraining order in full. There is no basis for her claims, and she fails to prove conduct under the Domestic Violence Prevention Act that would justify a restraining order." A lot of people on Reddit and YouTube noted that this seems like kind of a "it didn't happen, but it's okay if it did" sort of thing, but I read it as Seth covering all of the legal bases. This was likely not just Seth writing this document, it was likely Seth and a lawyer. So him saying, "I didn't do it and it wouldn't be basis even if I did," in my opinion, seems like it's probably the lawyer saying, "Hey, also point that out." Or perhaps the lawyer is the one who did the final edit of the document anyway. Anyway, that's speculation, maybe Seth is just being weird here. Seth then went on to cover specific incidents not mentioned in Katie's document, which is why I think that this is probably not a response to that directly, but a response to the domestic violence restraining order filing as a whole. The most recent of those incidents was from August 16th, 2016, which was a day before the restraining order was granted, and Seth wrote that the incident in question involved claims that he was watching Katie sleep and yelling at her for not being willing to beat Sebastian. Seth categorically denied doing either of those things and said that what actually transpired was entirely different. According to Seth, he had asked Sebastian to clean his room, but Sebastian told him that he didn't need to listen to anything that Seth said, and that Seth should apologize for telling him what to do. Seth claims that he attempted to appropriately discipline him by sternly telling him that under no circumstances should he ever speak to any adult in that way. At this, he says that Sebastian ran downstairs, jumped into his mother's lap, and then told her that he hated his father and wished he would leave and never come back. Katie allegedly walked outside after Sebastian had calmed down, at which point Seth says that Sebastian apologized and told him he loves him and he wants to live with him after all. And yes, I know it sounds a little, and then the whole bus clapped. Seth continued that after this incident, I was very upset, but I was never violent in any way. And he said the neighbor was in the house and watched the entire thing unfold. Supposedly, the neighbor asked what was wrong and said that the whole thing was kind of uncomfortable to witness, but Seth said he just wanted to go outside, have a cup of coffee, and calm down. He finished that story by reaffirming that he had not acted violently toward her or anyone in the house and had not yelled at her because she wouldn't beat Sebastian, her in this case being Katie. The second instance he addressed involved Katie's claim that on August 22nd, 2016, Seth was being belligerent and yelling at her and their son. He denied that this occurred at all, and from a legal standpoint, rightfully pointed out that this is not cause for a domestic violence restraining order. He explained that on this day, he and Katie had been arguing about how they were going to proceed with the divorce, which had been filed, but at the time, they were still living together, and they needed to figure out how to handle that tension. He says that during that argument, he left the home and slammed the door behind him. But that is not what broke the door. According to him, the door was already broken. He didn't elaborate on the specifics of the argument, but he did say that he never once acted violently and never once did he encourage her to beat their son. The final instance noted in the document is a claim that on October 11th, 2016, Seth was angry at Sebastian and hit him as a result, which Seth categorically denied doing. He pointed out that Sebastian suffers from a rare condition called 6q27 chromosomal deletion syndrome, and one of the symptoms of that is it causes you to hit and bite yourself out of frustration. Seth explained that Sebastian has been known to throw himself to the ground during these incidents, and that this is a very common occurrence for him, and others have witnessed him doing this. And in support of this claim, he says he filed declarations from some of these witnesses. Seth did describe the events of that day in the filing, but he gave a much more detailed version of the story to the Pascal show on April 5th. To be clear, that is April 5th of this year, not April 5th of 2016. Seth claimed that on that day he made Sebastian a deal, which was if the boy cleaned his room, then they could go swimming, because Sebastian, as all the parents have agreed, loves swimming. Seth said that he went off to go play a computer game, and that every 30 to 45 minutes he would go and he would check up on Sebastian, but at no point had Sebastian cleaned his room. He also clarified that only he and Sebastian were in the home at the time because Katie was already down by the pool with some of her girlfriends. Finally, about 4 or 5 hours after he had told Sebastian to clean up so that they could go to the pool, he went up to check on him and found that the room was now more of a mess than before, and that Sebastian was sitting butt naked playing his Wii. Rather than admonishing Sebastian, rather than yelling at him, punishing him for not doing his chores, Seth says that he just simply went to his own room, put on his swim trunks, got his beach towel, and then walked past Sebastian's door. And he says that when he walked by Sebastian's door, Sebastian noticed and mentioned that he also wanted to go swimming. Seth told him that since he hadn't cleaned his room or made his bed, he was not allowed to go swimming, and this made Sebastian very upset. Sebastian allegedly stormed across the room, stomping his feet, and in the process stomped on a Hot Wheels car, then tripped and began to fall towards the doorframe. Seth said that when this happened, he reached out and tried to put his hand between Sebastian's head and the wall, emphasizing that he'd much rather Sebastian hit his hand than the wood due to the fluid pocket on his brain. After ensuring Sebastian was okay, Seth says that he went downstairs and started to swim laps in the pool, and not long after that, Sebastian ran downstairs and jumped into his mom's lap and said, "Daddy hit me." It was at this point that he says Katie turned around and filed because we were in the middle of the divorce, still living in the same residence. She turned around and child abuse, domestic violence, and had a move-out order issued, and they served it like 3 days later. And I should be clear at this point that none of what he told Pascal on April 5th, 2024 contradicts anything in his 2016 filing, in which he notes that Katie never called the police, and Katie never took Sebastian for any medical care as a result of this alleged incident. He finished by stating Katie never took any action whatsoever consistent with a parent whose child had been abused. Katie's allegation that I abused Sebastian in any way is completely false. Now, with regard to the more vague allegations of him having temper and drug issues, Seth argued that it was untrue that he yelled and screamed at her with balled fists, as she alleged, and that while he was on painkillers, they were legitimately prescribed. He agreed that he did yell at her at times and that they did argue, but that he never threatened her with violence. As for the drugs he was taking, they were for 9 herniated discs in his back, a torn meniscus in his left knee, and 3 tears in his right shoulder, all of which should be corroborable by his doctor. In addition, he stated that he was in physical therapy for his injuries, and whoever the physical therapist was, they should also have records of this, unless those records were destroyed. Now, them being destroyed would not necessarily be suspicious after 8 years. If they're digital, however, might be a little weird. Adding on to all of that, he said that he finds it ridiculous that Katie alleges she is in fear of him, as even if he was acting violently, he would not be able to physically abuse her due to his injuries. While I am in great physical pain, he argued, Katie is not only physically healthy, but as she is in the Navy, she has received training in physical combat techniques. She has no fear of me. That one, I have to say, feels a little flimsy, given that Seth seems to be a rather large man, but at the same time, Katie does not appear to be much of a small woman, and if Seth was legitimately that injured, I could see where he's coming from. The next portion of the document is his response to Katie's child custody order request, which, while is not explicitly described at any point in the document, it seems was designed to prevent Seth from seeing Sebastian, based on what Seth said in the document. Seth wrote, I find it disheartening that Katie alleges Sebastian has anything to fear from me. I have always been Sebastian's primary caregiver. As Katie is in the Navy and is stationed on board a ship, she works and is often deployed while I act as a stay-at-home dad. I care for Sebastian's day-to-day needs, and this is a continuous task given his special needs due to his condition. I love it and embrace it, even though it can be troubling at times. Sebastian and I have built a special bond due to the fact that I am always home with him, taking care of him. He has no reason to fear me. I should note that I have not verified this yet, but it seems that at this time, Sebastian had not yet been diagnosed with autism. Towards the end of the document, Seth outlined what he believed was really going on here, saying that Katie only filed this request for a domestic violence restraining order in order to gain a tactical advantage in our divorce. He suggested that Katie cooked up the domestic violence accusation as a way to kick him out of the house and to prevent him from seeing his son. Lastly, Seth addressed Katie's request that the court order him to pay her attorney's fees, even though Seth was a stay-at-home dad with no significant income of his own, and Katie was an E5 in the Navy with, at this time, based on what I found on her LinkedIn, at least 5 years of experience. While not a huge payday, the salary and benefits for a Navy E5 with 4+ years of experience and 2 dependents are nothing to sneeze at. So basically, Seth's argument here was, Katie doesn't need me to pay her attorney's fees, she can pay them herself. In fact, not only that, but Seth argued that since she made significantly more than he did, and because her request was, as he put it, baseless and unnecessary, it should be her paying for his attorney's fees, not the other way around. And then in his conclusion, he restated his main points, writing that Katie and Sebastian have no reason to fear me. I have never harmed, harassed, or threatened them. Katie's request for a domestic violence restraining order is simply a tactic she is using to try and get me kicked out of the marital residence and cease my contact with our son. I respectfully request the court deny her request in full. I also request the court order Katie to pay my reasonable attorney's fees to defend against her false accusations. In the end, the domestic violence restraining order did not go through, and it seems that Seth was granted shared custody with no specific time arrangements. Now, it is of course possible that Seth is everything Katie described and that he just got very lucky and managed to weasel out of these allegations. But I think we need to go through the claims and evidence here because they're all rather important to the point I'm trying to make. Looking back at this, Katie accused Seth of multiple incidences of child abuse, citing numerous witnesses including teachers, neighbors, social workers, therapists, and naval personnel as they would have had to process this alleged ban of Seth from the naval base. Included amongst her claims were accusations that Seth had hit Sebastian in the head in front of a teacher while being fully aware that his son had a pocket of fluid in his brain. She also said that while she was on deployment, a then 7-year-old Sebastian would be abandoned for long periods of time and her neighbors would have to tell him to go home and lock the door, but none of them called CPS. Katie also said that when she brought the temporary restraining order to Sebastian's school, they notified her that they had called CPS a week prior. And then, in addition to the accusations that involved witnesses, she also accused Seth of a number of other inappropriate and unacceptable behaviors. She claimed that he would frequently expose himself to Sebastian by walking around the house naked. She said that Seth would get angry at their son, throwing him to the ground and beating him, and that he would at times whip him repeatedly with a belt. And when it came to Seth's behavior towards her, she accused him of threatening her with violence and preventing her from seeking help or communicating with her family. The problem is that when I see all of this laid out, even if we totally ignore Seth's version of the story, it seems utterly impossible to me that she could be telling the truth given the outcome of the case. Considering the number of witnesses she claimed to have, her behavior in the 9 months between returning from deployment and filing for that TRO, and the resources she had through the military, it just doesn't add up. Seth was a stay-at-home dad while she worked on a military base, so she had plenty of time away from Seth in a place where he could only access with her permission. Due to that, I don't see how she could claim that Seth was preventing her from communicating with friends and family. Even if he was monitoring her calls and texts, she could have easily used a computer at work. Then there's the allegations of Seth abusing and abandoning Sebastian, which were supposedly witnessed by a teacher and by neighbors. Despite this, the court did not grant Katie a domestic violence restraining order, when testimony to these claims certainly should have won her the case. Finally, while not a claim with witnesses, there is the fact that she accused Seth of picking Sebastian up, throwing him to the ground, and then proceeding to beat him. Now keep in mind, this was not listed in the domestic violence restraining order petition. So this happened before August. This happened a while ago. However, she didn't file a police report, didn't take Sebastian to the hospital, and did not request a temporary restraining order at the time that this supposedly occurred. Instead, she waited several months and then chose to file for a TRO when Sebastian claimed Seth had hit him at a time that she did not witness it. So just to be clear here, when Katie actively witnessed Seth picking up an 8-year-old with a fluid pocket on his brain, slamming him to the ground and then beating him, that was not enough for a temporary restraining order. However, when Sebastian, clearly completely fine, ran downstairs and claimed he'd been hit at a time when Katie was not there to witness it, that's when she chose to file the order. To top all of it off, if this were true, then Katie's recent decision to allow Sebastian to move in with his father full-time would be remarkably irresponsible, if not criminally negligent. And yet, according to Chris, Katie, and Seth, the plan was, in 2024, for Sebastian to move in with his father full-time. So in 2016, Seth is a horribly abusive person who is a danger to Sebastian, routinely beats him, does things that arguably could kill him given his condition, yells at him, screams at him, just all around horrible person, horrible parent. But in 2024, he's fine. Like I said, it's possible that Seth just got really, really lucky, but from what I'm seeing, it seems that nobody was able to offer convincing testimony in support of Katie. And that's not the only thing I found odd about her claims. You see, as I went through the allegations, I started to see a pattern in what Katie said and did about Seth's alleged abuse. Katie said that Seth hit Sebastian with a belt. Katie took out a TRO, which is something Chris did. Katie said that her ex-spouse was unstable, which is something Chris did. So why is that relevant? Well, that's what I've been working towards this whole time. If you take Chris, Katie, Nina, and Seth's stories all together, then I think there are some questions worthy of further investigation by the authorities. After a few weeks of doing quite literally nothing but this, I think it's worth asking how long Chris and Katie have been together, how Sebastian and Faith factor into their relationship, and why it could be the key to understanding Sebastian's disappearance. In order to understand how all of this fits together, however, I think we need to start by laying out the complete timeline of events, beginning with Chris and Katie being stationed at the same base in December of 2015. After that, Katie filed for divorce from Seth in February of 2016 and a temporary restraining order against him in August of 2016. Meanwhile, Chris married Nina Gomez in the summer of 2016, and she became pregnant that September. Shortly after that, Nina moved home to Albuquerque, and she claims this is because Chris was not supporting her and encouraged her to get an abortion. Then, Chris was allegedly caught disposing of Nina's things in mid-April of 2017, and this was supposedly witnessed by his neighbors. Faith was born in June of 2017, after which Chris suggested that Nina move to his hometown of Hendersonville. After that move, Chris and Nina got in a fight over a text message from a female coworker of Chris's at the end of August or beginning of September 2017. And I want to be clear here that it was Chris who said it was a coworker. Chris filed a temporary protective order against Nina in mid-September of 2017, but lost the attempt to get a full protective order at the beginning of October, allowing Nina to return to New Mexico and file for divorce and custody there. We also know, based on their own words, that Chris and Katie were living together at the time of Sebastian's assault by that older boy, which can only have occurred in 2017 because Sebastian was 8 at the time. Chris and Nina's divorce was finalized in August of 2018, and Chris almost immediately filed a motion to sanction Nina for allegedly not following the agreed-upon parenting plan in October of 2018. Nina then motioned for permission to relocate within the state of New Mexico on April 12th of 2019, and Chris motioned to prevent it. Possibly as a result of whatever happened during those proceedings, on August 21st of 2019, Chris was ordered by the court to take 24 hours of parenting skills classes, as well as 12 hours of high conflict behavior skill training, which he objected to on September 3rd. So just to be clear here with the timeline, on August 21st, 2019, Chris received a court order saying he needed parenting skills classes. Chris's objection was rejected, and he informed the court of his completed courses on November 19th of 2019, and it seems COVID put a pause on the whole affair until Nina motioned to modify the parenting plan in April of 2021. The plan was amended in October, but there's no details on what any changes were or if Chris objected to them. Almost a year later, in August of 2022, Nina switched Faith from the local public school, Bosque Farms Elementary, to a Native American academy in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And it was at this point that Chris motioned to relocate Faith to Tennessee and to grant him primary custody, because apparently this was an unapproved change in schooling. Nina, on the other hand, says that she moved her to the academy because it was closer to where the other two children went to school, and she was trying to make the commute easier for everybody. After both sides presented their cases for why this was bad versus why this was good, it seems that the court sided with Nina yet again. Interesting little tidbit about this is that about a month after Chris motioned to get full custody of Faith, he closed on the current Proudfoot home in Hendersonville, Tennessee. Now, I can't say for certain, but that would suggest that he put the offer on the house in, July or August of 2022, before or when he filed for custody of Faith. Not much in the court record for another year or so, but in September of 2023, Chris requested a hearing, though the reason for doing so is unclear. The motion was for a written report on relocation, but beyond that, there's no information. Whatever the reason for the motion, however, on November 16th of 2023, Nina was ordered to appear before the court to show cause via Zoom, and that hearing was to take place on January 2nd, 2024. On December 27, 2023, Nina was served with the same order to appear before the court on January 2nd that she had received on November 16, 2023. And according to Nina, this whole thing with her being served those documents again was a setup to make her look crazy so that they could then, at the January 2nd hearing, file an emergency ex parte motion for modification of custody and a psychological evaluation of Nina, with the evidentiary hearing scheduled for March 5th, 2024. Before they got to that hearing, however, on February 26, 2024, Sebastian Rogers was reported missing at around 6:30 a.m. after Katie claimed she woke up and he was not in the home. Chris filed for a continuance in his custody case on February 29th and then again on March 19th before filing a motion to seal the records of that custody case on March 25th, which you may remember is the same day they appeared on Nancy Grace. Affidavits and subpoenas were thrown around for a few months after this until June 6th, when Chris filed an emergency ex parte motion which I believe was intended to force Nina to send Faith to live with him for the summer, per their parenting plan. Nina responded the very next day with an objection, but her objection was rejected on the 10th, and she had to send Faith to stay with Chris for the summer. The most recent update to this case, per the court records, as of shooting this on July 29th, 2024, is that Chris has filed a motion to return to the status quo and yet again sanction Nina, who currently, so far as I'm aware, has Faith. So, with all of that in mind, I want law enforcement to consider the following facts. Chris and Katie Proudfoot have avoided saying precisely when they met, and as we know, it's possible they met as early as December 2015. Katie accused Seth of doing many of the same things in 2016 that Nina would go on to accuse Chris of doing in 2017, and followed the same legal playbook that Chris would a year later when trying to take Faith. Chris Proudfoot has been married 5 times in about 25 years. He was in the military the whole time, and service members are known to sometimes marry just for the benefits. To elaborate on that, when Chris married Nina, he would have received better housing and benefits as a husband with 3 dependents, even after Nina moved back to Albuquerque, so long as she didn't divorce him. When Katie divorced Seth, she would have lost those same benefits, which would have downgraded her lifestyle. And we know that Chris married Nina around the same time that Katie kicked Seth out. We know that Nina did not move back to San Diego at any point, and that shortly after Faith was born, she moved to Hendersonville at Chris's request. And for most of this time, she stayed with Chris's mother. This put her in a position where she had no one around to support her if something were to go wrong with Chris or his family. In simple terms, she was as isolated as she could possibly be. At this time, Chris was still stationed and spending the majority of his time in San Diego, now without any possibility of Nina sneaking up on him, because his family could tell him if she were going to do so. When he did return to Hendersonville to help move Nina into their new apartment, he received a text from a female coworker, as he put it, which Nina interpreted to be romantic in nature, and she accused him of cheating. Now consider that Chris was in the Navy and stationed at a base in San Diego, and Katie was in the Navy and stationed at that same base in San Diego, meaning she could be considered a female coworker. As we addressed, Chris has been extremely cagey about when he and Nina met, but I think we can triangulate it. And here's how we do that. Chris said he'd been around for half of Sebastian's life at a time when Sebastian had just turned 15, which gives us a window of 7 to 8 years, or 6 to 9 if we're being generous. Seth said that when Sebastian was assaulted, Chris and Katie were living together at the time, which is something that the Proudfoots have confirmed in several interviews. Seth also said that Sebastian was 8 when the assault happened, which means that it must have happened by the end of 2017. On top of that, we know that sometime between mid-July of 2017 and the end of August 2017, Chris received a text message from a female coworker that Nina interpreted as cheating. If we put all of that together, then Chris and Katie started living together before December of 2017. And based on the fact that Chris allegedly received this message at the end of August 2017, it seems very likely to me that Chris and Katie began dating before Chris even filed that TPO against Nina. We also know that after the custody grab failed and Nina filed for divorce, Chris spent the next several years pestering her in court over every little thing and filing for primary custody multiple times. And since we know that Chris and Katie began living together at the very latest in December of 2017, we also know that Katie has been a parent in Chris's household since that point, and therefore she must have been involved to some extent in this custody case. She must have been an active participant of some kind. That is to say, at the very least, she was aware of these court proceedings. Now, if you recall that weird, vague story that Chris told from the very beginning of this episode, all of that seems to have happened sometime after the Proudfoots moved to Hendersonville, so that's probably between 2022 and 2024. They may have returned to Hendersonville as early as 2022, but that's the earliest I can confirm that they were there. In any case, when that Duchess panel asked Chris if there was a reason he wouldn't want Sebastian around his daughter, he told them, "There's some things that can be spoke of, and there's some things that will not be spoke of, and personal issues inside my family are strictly that they have no bearing on this investigation. The cops are well aware of everything involving specifics, and that's quite honestly, I know this is going to sound snarky and rude, but it's really nobody's business as to that because it has no bearing on this case. Okay, and for the record, I will say this, all 3 parents have an agreement and we all understand this." That was not an answer to the question, but thankfully Chris did tell us that all 3 parents understand this, and Seth told us that Chris didn't want Sebastian around his daughter. I would be willing to consider that this is kind of a he said, she said thing, if not for the fact that Chris all but admitted to it by describing an entire incident involving the cops and family members while actively shipping Sebastian off to Seth as he's vying for custody of Faith. Just to be clear, Chris most recently began making moves to get custody of his daughter towards the end of 2023, which is around the same time that he approached Seth and suggested Sebastian move in with him. We also know that Nina's story about what happened at the airport is at least somewhat truthful, because the court records show that there was a motion for a psych eval against her, paired with custody changes. To my knowledge, the Proudfoots actually haven't denied any of Nina's claims, though it is possible, if unlikely, that they're unaware of them. And in case Chris happens to be watching this, I'm perfectly willing to be completely wrong about you. In fact, I'd love to be, but you have some explaining to do. And finally, we know that the Proudfoots left town in the middle of the search after what has all but universally been described as a lackluster effort to find their son. And on top of that, we know that Chris has lied so very many times. Anyway, now that I've put all of that out on the table, I'm realizing how aggressively convoluted the whole thing is, and I'm just hoping that I've been able to lay it out in a way that makes sense for you. Now, for the last couple of weeks, I have been telling you guys that I have a hypothesis, and I have been sitting on it and not releasing what it is. And some people in the comments understandably asked if I was ever going to give the hypothesis, or if I was just going to keep saying I had one so that we could draw out as many views from this case as possible. I am assuming those people are not familiar with our channel. That said, I understand where they're coming from, and I was being legitimate when I said that I was holding off on it because I wanted to compile as much as I could first so that I would be confident about what I was suggesting. I am now finally mostly confident in my hypothesis. So without anything further, here's my hypothesis. Call me crazy, but consider the following scenario. Chris Proudfoot married Nina Gomez for the benefits and had no intention of living with her. At some point during their marriage, possibly even prior to it, he began dating Katie Proudfoot. Chris was upset when Nina got pregnant because that meant a commitment beyond a legal contract. When she decided to have the baby anyway, Chris decided he wanted to keep his daughter but not his wife and made arrangements to separate them. He had Nina move to Tennessee in order to both isolate her from her family and surround her with his, and to ensure that the courts would be more favorable to him as a local. He then waited until an opportunity arose to separate Nina from Faith and filed the TPO, assuming that the justice system would side with him, but he miscalculated and lost the case. Then, at some point during the last few years, something occurred with Sebastian that made Chris distrust him enough not to want him around Faith, and maybe interfered with his attempts to get custody. And that is where I get stuck, and I'm not sure how to progress without further answers from law enforcement or more research into the interviews given by the Proudfoots. But I find it extremely unlikely that Sebastian left the house on his own, barefoot, into the cold, based on the fact that he notably hated walking barefoot outdoors, and dogs were unable to track a scent just hours later. If he didn't leave barefoot, then he may have left wearing shoes, but that doesn't explain the decision to leave into the cold without his phone or his Nintendo Switch. And there's also the fact that not a single camera saw him. That would suggest to me that he left in a car, but he certainly didn't drive, which means someone must have driven him. There are very few people that Sebastian would trust enough to get into a car with, and even fewer people who had access to the home. Sebastian had no contact with anyone but approved adults, so we're talking about somebody who must be very close to him, and likely very, very trusted by Katie and Chris. So aside from Seth, his father, it seems like the only people who would have access to Sebastian at this time would be his own family. And after looking through everything, while I'm not going to say that we can rule out Seth being abusive in the past, I think we can rule Seth out as a suspect in this case. Is it possible that someone, be it Katie, Kathy, Melissa, or any other member of the Proudfoot clan, spirited Sebastian away in the middle of the night to hide him somewhere? Or maybe Sebastian never made it home that night at all, since the last time anyone other than family saw him was as they were leaving dinner Sunday night. I doubt Katie wanted her son dead, and I don't think that she would stand by Chris if Sebastian was, which means that kidnapping by family is, so far as I'm concerned, the most likely scenario. But why? Chris had gotten what he wanted with Sebastian moving out of the house, so there was no reason to make him disappear on that front. Having your one child go missing while you're actively fighting for custody of the other probably doesn't help your case, so I doubt this was plan A, so to speak. The only thing that I could imagine would warrant this would be Sebastian throwing a wrench into the custody battle, and this would probably be related to the abuse by Chris. From there, I can see two main possibilities. The first is that should Sebastian testify in this custody battle, or should he be allowed to give a statement in this custody battle, well, he's autistic. His testimony would be very honest, and a very honest testimony from Sebastian would be very bad for Chris. The second is that Chris misrepresented his most recent encounter with CPS after he beat Sebastian with a belt for at least the second time, and the case was more serious than he let on. Now remember, Chris said in his interviews that this CPS worker came to the house, took Sebastian outside, and then told Sebastian, "Hey, buddy, when you're being punished, you shouldn't tell anyone. You're gonna get your dad in trouble. Don't do that. Don't report when you're being punished." A lot of you rightfully noted that the way that Chris described Sebastian's conversation with that caseworker did not sound like any caseworker you'd ever heard of. And I have to agree. So just really quick, let's go back and take a look at what Chris said his encounter with that CPS worker was like when Sebastian was 15, okay? She's like, "Oh, hey," "Hey, I'm already, don't." She's like, "Don't tell me anything, but I'm gonna tell you what I know happened." And I said, "Okay." She goes, "Boom, boom, boom." She told me exactly what happened. I said, "Yes, ma'am." She goes, "Oh my God." I said, "Yes, ma'am. This is how it's been." Sebastian thought by telling on me, making it sound like I was so horrible, that I was gonna get in trouble over something stupid. It was like, "No, Sebastian, you got punished, man. You got punished." And he was like, but, and I was like, "You got punished." And the lady took him outside. She goes, "Sebastian, just because you get in trouble and you get punished, you need to understand when you go and say things about people and you lie and you fabricate things and you make it sound worse than what it is, sir, you can get in trouble for that." So we had that happen. The lady was like, "I am so sorry." I said, "No, he's just a child. He's upset is what it is. I'm okay with it." He set that back down on the dinner table and was like, "See, eat your food." And we went back and everything's been fine. By the way, he also said that this was the second time they'd had that specific caseworker. And here, where was it? So he shows, he makes the report. They come to the house, and the lady who comes to the house is the same lady she's had a case before. Now, mind you, he said that there was only one incident with a belt and CPS only showed up once, but that's neither here nor there. We know he's a liar. But so the CPS worker shows up a second time, and as we all know, social workers are always very quick to be very friendly to parents the second time they're called to that house. In case it wasn't clear, we're into the pure speculation part. So, not buying that one. We already know that Chris has lied about CPS. Why would he not lie about what happened when CPS came to the door? The only way the report from that CPS visit gets out there is if the police charge the Proudfoots and they use it as evidence in a trial, or if a CPS caseworker working out of that office were to leak it. So yeah, I would not be shocked at all if Chris lied about that encounter. It just would not surprise me. But the question then is, would missing child look better than abused child to a custody court? But just to reiterate, bring things back, reset, make sure we're all on the same page about where we are. The suggestion was that maybe that CPS visit was a little bit more serious than he let on, and he did not want the New Mexico courts finding out about it. Would CPS or the custody court be less concerned about a missing child than an abused child? I frankly do not know, and it's not a question I ever thought I'd have to ask. But also, how would that work once the case is over? I mean, does he miraculously appear back in Hendersonville and, tragically, due to the trauma and his being autistic, he goes nonverbal and refuses to talk about anything that happened, and then they just kind of send him on his way? Now, of course, I have to remind everybody that this is a hypothetical scenario that I feel is possible based on the evidence that I have accumulated and presented. My sole interest is to explain my findings in the hopes that they may lead to new avenues in the search for Sebastian Rogers. I am in no way asserting that the hypothetical scenario I described today is to be understood as an allegation of any kind, nor am I making the claim that any party is responsible for Sebastian's disappearance. By the time this video goes live, all of the research that I have compiled will have already been sent to the FBI and the TBI, as well as the Davidson and Shelby County Sheriff's Departments. I genuinely do believe that Sebastian was kidnapped, if not by his family, then by somebody else with access to the Proudfoot home. And either way, I do not see a reason to believe that he's not still alive out there somewhere. For my part, I am praying day in and day out that he is, because I know that is precisely what I would want from everyone if my little brother was missing. My little brother with autism, of whom I see so much in Sebastian, and for whom I would never stop searching, no matter what the cost.